I'm Bonnie Erbe. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Joining us today is the newly appointed president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Mini Timmaraju. Welcome to the program. How are you?
Thank you so much, Bonnie, and just a delight to be here. Thrilled to be here. Big fan of you and your work and the perspective you bring.
Thank you. You're too kind. You have a huge job cut out for yourself. Let's do a little history here. I think the high point for abortion rights, at least in terms of laws in this country, was probably the decade or so after Roe was handed down in the early 70s. And ever since then, there have been more and more and more restrictive state laws approved. And even, I believe, even though a majority of Americans approve of abortion rights in some form, there's not as strong support as there was in the 70s and 80s. How are you going to combat that?
So that's a great question. It's definitely, we're seeing the culmination of almost, since Roe to now, almost 50 years of the steady drip of restrictive regulations at the state level and some challenges at the federal level. Abortion has become an incredibly partisan issue that's not helpful. In the 70s, we definitely had Republican support, and we've seen that whittle away, at least with elected officials. But our extensive polling and research at NARAL Pro-Choice America shows 7 out of 10 Americans support reproductive freedom. And there was recently, I think, a great poll published, I want to say by ABC and Washington Post, that indicated majority support in the country. Our data shows more support than that. I think, frankly, we have to really dig in a little bit of how pollsters are asking these questions. But we know the majority of Americans support the constitutional right to abortion. That being said, we also know we're entering a challenging period as a result of the last administration, a very anti-abortion court. We don't want to there's no reason to sugarcoat it. And with the recent actions, or lack of action, I should say, around SB 8 in Texas and the upcoming December 1st hearing on the Mississippi case, the Jackson case, we are anticipating some bad news. I think the good news is Democrats in Congress have been really aggressive about pushing forward the Women's Health Protection Act. I'd love to talk more about that if we have time, because I think what we're seeing now is we have a court we've always counted as women, right? We've counted on the courts to protect our constitutional rights, but we are in a moment right now where we need to count on Congress to protect our constitutional rights. They are prepared to do so. So we have to take all of the energy around what's going to happen with the Supreme Court, and really what NARAL will do is leverage that to elevate the issues back to the forefront again into next year's midterms, which we know will be challenging. But I don't believe the vast majority of Americans will stand for a rollback of our constitutional right to reproductive freedom. And we have
what do you think would happen if the Supreme Court? I covered the court for 9 years in the late 80s and through most of the 90s. And back then it was always said that even as the number of conservative justices grew on the court, that they would never overturn Roe. They might take all of its power away, deflate it completely, but they would not overturn at least, verbiage approving a woman's right to choose, for fear of demonstrations,
the kind of backlash we're talking about, right?
Economic havoc, women striking, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't want to bring that. They were not so political that they were willing to deal with the consequences of overturning Roe. Has that changed?
It remains to be seen if that's changed, but I think you said something very important that I want to rewind really quickly. You said they would go all the way up to just short of the technicality of overturning Roe. We're anticipating that. But what you also said was it effectively doesn't matter. They are effectively making it impossible for women and people reproductive age to access abortion. That's the critical piece. And we, as reproductive rights advocates, have to do a better job with our allies and our partners of educating the American public that even if they let Roe stand on a technicality, the lack of access to abortion, which has effectively made Roe overturned in places like Texas and potentially Mississippi, is what we're going to see happen in 26 states immediately if the court decides to uphold the Mississippi ban. It does, and I think you can have legal scholars on, and we can have a debate about the technicality of Roe, but ultimately we already know in that significant parts of America, we don't have access to abortion. We don't have access to the full range of care. And we're being hamstrung in our ability to provide the latest medical technologies to make it easy. In a moment where we should be able to have more reproductive freedom and access than ever, some legislatures are making it harder. So anything short of an actual protection and expansion of rights is a loss. And I think American women are paying attention to that.
What about young women? Are they paying as much attention as young women of my generation were? I mean, back then there were marches, there were strikes, there were constant news conferences, and there wasn't this, it took a long time for the religious right to organize. Apparently, I've read data or stories that show that particularly the Catholic Church was not organized when Roe was handed down. They didn't expect it. And so it took them 10 or more years to get going. Now they have gotten going all the way. And it seems like, and they're winning, I think most political analysts would look at the situation and say they are winning, regardless of public opinion.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think what we're seeing is an unprecedented time of minority rule in a variety of areas of public opinion, not just abortion. And it's something we need to be extremely mindful of. Campaigns of misinformation, degradation of democracy, voting rights, all of these things are impacting our ability to have elected leaders and legislative bodies that truly reflect public opinion. But to your question about the younger generation, I'll be candid. I was born a month after Roe v. Wade was decided. I've only had, thanks to women of my mother's generation, your generation, I've had access and my constitutional rights protected since I was born and immigrated to this country. I've only known a country where we've had Roe as the fundamental law of the land. So we do have some work to do to generate, frankly, outrage in all Americans. And we do have to double down on our communication to younger women and younger advocates. And I think young men are paying a lot of attention to this too. And they have a much more progressive viewpoint into what the full range of reproductive health care looks like for Americans. I will say this, what gives me hope, I worked on the 2016 campaign for Hillary Clinton. I was her women's vote director. It was a really tough time, got a lot of questions like the one you just asked me about millennial women, younger women and their support of the secretary. In the end, we found we had a lot of support. We won the popular vote. Younger women did support our candidate. And most importantly, when we lost, we saw an uprising of women that has sustained itself with the Women's March. We saw activists doing marches and rallies across the country after SB 8. We are seeing a younger generation of reproductive rights and justice advocates, particularly led by women of color, young women of color, rising up in these states and saying, absolutely not on my watch, bans off our bodies. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope for this next generation. And it's the enthusiasm the women of my generation need to continue to sustain the fight that women before us started in the 70s. So I know it's going to be a tough time, but out of great adversity comes, frankly, innovation and great strategy. And I think we're going to see some really exciting things happen in the movement next year.
And let's get back to Congress. You were talking about heavily lobbying Congress for access to choice. Obviously, the House is held by Democrats now by a 5-vote majority. The Senate is split evenly, with Vice President Harris coming in to weigh in the Democrats' favor. How much meaningful legislation can you get passed with these slimmest of majority?
We have to protect our slim majorities in the House and the Senate. We have to eliminate the filibuster. We've been pretty unequivocal about that. We've been pretty clear with our friends in the House and the Senate and the White House. We need that to fundamentally protect voting rights, which is the baseline for all of these fights. Let's be clear. We need that to protect Roe, and by passing the Women's Health Protection Act. We know that the Democrats in the Senate are committed to doing this, but we have to eliminate the filibuster first. And then that's not enough. We have to turn out.
People have been trying that for a while now, and it hasn't worked.
I think we have to keep pushing. It's not over yet. We did just see the president pass the big infrastructure bill. We're working on Build Back Better. Paid family leave, I just want to say, is something that NARAL and the reproductive rights organizations are deeply committed to. There's a continuum of issues that affect women in this country. It starts with reproductive freedom, and childcare and access to paid family leave is a critical piece of that. So we're taking the steps towards getting to that moment. But you're right, it's going to be very challenging. And let's say we get there and we're hopeful. And frankly, this is all part of the continuum of advocacy, right? We're only going to get there by really turning out in numbers around the country, around December 1st, around SCOTUS, around ACT. We have to keep the pressure up on our friends in the Senate. They want to do the right thing, but we have to help them do the right thing. Then we have to get past next year's midterms. So we cannot move. We have to continue to push the energy and the outrage around what's happening with the courts to the ballot box. So at NARAL, what we get to do is really 360 advocacy. We start, with elections, we work on the Hill, we advocate in legislatures, and then we're back at the ballot box. We've got to show, Democrats have to show Americans that they're going to deliver. So it starts with the Women's Health Protection Act, and that's going to help us motivate folks to understand it's Congress that's going to protect our constitutional rights in a time when the courts are failing us.
Now, let me talk about two technological developments in the last 50 years that have really had an impact, one for, one against women's right to choose. The first one is the sonogram. And when there was a change in attitude on the part of women around this country when they could start seeing a picture of the fetus in the uterus. What did the abortion rights movement do to try to counteract that, if anything, and how much damage did it do to support for women's rights?
So that's a great question. I will say this. I worked in the Texas legislature on behalf of Planned Parenthood when one of the very first sonogram bills was introduced and frankly passed. And I can tell you firsthand from our work with
sonogram bills, meaning requiring women to have a sonogram before they could have an abortion.
I believe they called it, Bonnie, the mandatory ultrasound bill. And it was, you have to actually show the pregnant woman her ultrasound and have a conversation with her about it. And then there had to be a mandatory waiting period between the time she viewed her sonogram or ultrasound and the time she made the decision to have an abortion. Most women who are having an abortion, if they are given all of their access to care, are doing it early enough that we found that the sonograms didn't have any material effect on her decision. They did have an effect on her psychological well-being. They were bullying and intimidation tactics. But at the end of the day, what sonogram and ultrasound bills do is they assume a level of ignorance and callousness from women about their own bodies and their own reproductive choices. They also assume that medical professionals need legislatures to tell them how to properly counsel and advise their patients. They're deeply insulting. They prey upon some of the worst assumptions about women and our choices, and they're frankly largely ineffective except to create additional barriers and cost to patients. So no, I don't believe that sonogram, I think the advent of the sonogram, as a mom myself, having the chance to see my children for the first time on a sonogram, it can be a really beautiful, powerful moment. But when did I have the chance to actually, now I'll be clear and say my children are adopted and I was lucky that I got to see them on a sonogram. But when is the earliest time most pregnant people can see a sonogram, can see evidence of a child on a sonogram? By then, most abortions have been done, right? So I think there's a lot of misinformation that the right has effectively utilized to mislead Americans about the technology and the link.
But the right always talk about the second and third trimester abortions, raise the, how rare is that and how much is it exaggerated as a political tool?
It's pretty rare. It's dramatically exaggerated as a political tool. We know most Americans who choose abortion at that late date have compelling circumstances. There's been numerous debates on the House floor around so-called late-term abortion. These are all tactics to conflate and deflect from the reality of the choices people make around abortion and reproductive care. I think that's why we're seeing in Texas really outrageous efforts to take the choices away from families even earlier than 15 weeks, because they keep losing these arguments. If the vast majority of Americans truly bought the arguments of the right, we wouldn't be seeing these types of really insane bills coming out of Texas and Mississippi. And
why? Explain that for me.
Because I think the vast majority of Americans, like our polling and research shows, support reproductive freedom, and they do not want legislatures or the courts in the decision-making process between a woman, a pregnant person, and their doctor. Period.
Is the whole dispute over abortion rights, and I still want to get back to the second technological abortion, which is the chemical abortions,
sure,
or prescription abortions. Is it a religious war?
I think it's a good proxy war. I'm not sure it's a religious war. We also know the majority of Catholics support birth control and some access to abortion. We know the majority of most religions do. I think it's a extreme right versus the rest of America war. And I think that the evangelical community has allowed itself to be a proxy, and some in the Catholic community as well, to be at the forefront of these fights. I won't minimize it. I worked in an abortion provider. I had to cross through protesters every day to do my job in Houston, Texas, during the 40 days protests. So I won't minimize the effect of the organizing and the savvy of the organizing on the so-called religious right. But I don't believe that the religious right represents all Americans of religious faith and spirituality.
The right has also been, there's a protest that every Saturday just started not too far from my house. And I pass it every time I have to get to the expressway, and they're showing bloody fetuses and all the stuff, trying to make people physically ill, I guess, over the sight of an aborted fetus. And again, these are all pretty late-term abortions, which, as you mentioned, are the minority, the vast minority of abortions in America. But why didn't the left ever do that kind of opposition research that the right has done? Why not investigate who is funding the right and talk publicly about who it is, who's funding the anti-abortion movement, who's funding, I don't know, I guess you might say the evangelical church, the huge increase in members of evangelical churches, and do something like that, because this is indeed like a political campaign, or it has become so, unfortunately.
So I can't speak for the larger movement, but I will give you a few examples. I think these are all great points that you're making. However, I would say there has been a lot of effective research and work done by the reproductive rights movement around the sources of misinformation and challenging tactics on the right. I'll give you an example. In the early 2000s, NARAL actually was at the forefront of doing research and publishing information about so-called crisis pregnancy centers in places like Texas, organizations that were funded by the right and by extremists to misinform Americans about access to services. So these are organizations set up to provide so-called family planning services. And then you come in for your services or your sonogram, for example. There was a correlation between passage of sonogram bills and these organizations standing up and then being counseled against abortion. They did really incredible, smart expose work around this issue. They worked with coalition partners. I remember because I was lobbying the legislature and we were distributing this information. So there's a lot of great work happening. I think there is an argument that it's not breaking through in the mainstream media, and that these are arguments that work in certain populations in certain states. So we do have to do a much better job of amplifying the roots of these extremists and their organizations and their tactics. And I think, frankly, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have American families grappling with things like childcare, safe schools, COVID. It's hard to break through the noise to get them to pay attention to this issue. That's where what's about to happen on December 1st at the Supreme Court is an opportunity. So even though it's very scary and it's very challenging, it's an opportunity for us to capture the attention of mainstream Americans who we know 7 to 10 are supportive of reproductive freedom, that this is again under threat. I think a lot of us take for granted our access to reproductive rights, particularly those of us in states like California, New York, on the coasts. So we need the reminder, and we need to be a little bit alarmist. We need to be really raising the alarm that these could be taken away in 26 states in this country the minute Roe v. Wade is overturned.
All right, now let's get back to the second technological development, which is, of course, the ability to take pills and very early on in a pregnancy, and the zygote or fetus, whatever it is at that point, is dismissed from the body.
Medical technological advancements like Plan B, medication abortion, those are wonderful advances for reproductive freedom. And you have to ask yourself, why are so many conservative-led majority legislatures pushing back on access to the services, right? We should have over-the-counter birth control everywhere. We shouldn't have had to wait for the Affordable Care Act to have birth control without copays. We should be making all of these services as easily available as possible in the spirit of prevention. If our opposition was truly concerned about so-called late-term abortion, they would be fully supportive of things like medication abortion and Plan B, but they are not, because that's not really what this is about. This is about restricting access to care for Americans of reproductive age and making those decisions for us, and restricting our access to reproductive freedom. I think folks on our side have known that for a long time. They just need a healthy reminder, and we're about to have an opportunity to do that.
The Jackson case, tell me about that. The ruling won't come until the spring or early summer. So what impact in either direction do you think it will have?
So Mississippi has one remaining abortion clinic left in all of Mississippi. The Supreme Court, I keep talking about December 1st, that's when the Supreme Court is hearing the case, hinging on what the Jackson case is, a 15-week abortion ban in the state of Mississippi. So if the court lets that Mississippi ban stand, they will effectively have overturned Roe. And we know in 26 states, they will likely ban abortion immediately after the decision is made.
Ban it completely or ban it after 15 weeks?
That's a great question. We know that there's legislation to try to ban it completely. We have 12 states with trigger ban legislation, and we're tracking an additional number of states that have legislation ready to file the minute it happens. But let's be clear, even if they let abortion stand up to 15 weeks, they've effectively blocked access for most Americans to abortion. So we can't let that stand. Either way, we have to raise the alarm. There really is no positive outcome with the court granting this case the hearing. So and frankly, Roe should have always been the floor and not the ceiling, right? You started our conversation by talking about how much erosion there's been of reproductive rights since 1973. And that's because even though Roe stands currently, many, many states have gone above and beyond to restrict access. And so this is the beginning of our community and our country fighting back to expand access to abortion care, expand access to reproductive rights and medication abortion, and not let any more rollbacks happen.
If you had to make a prediction, look into your crystal ball, how do you see the court deciding Jackson?
I think at the end of the day, we think, if I were to guess, and I hate to guess on something as critical as the court, we know the majority, we know the makeup of the court. We know the makeup of the court. We know their history on these issues. I think we need to go in ready and prepared to see them uphold the Mississippi ban. Maybe with some caveats, which the right will spin as, see, hysterical feminists, you have not lost your complete right to abortion. And then we will have to do our job with our colleagues in the media to make sure folks understand we've had a significant damage to our access already. And this just emboldens states to take further action that's very damaging and will really, really hurt people in this country.
All right. That's it for this edition. Thank you so much, Mini Timmaraju, for joining us and taking over NARAL Pro-Choice America. Let's continue the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and our website, www.tothecontrary.org. And if you agree or think to the contrary, join us next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.